The massive white stallion charged into the churning river, teeth clamping onto James's collar as the veteran's lungs burned for oxygen and darkness closed in. What James couldn't possibly know, as he coughed up water on the riverbank, was that the wild horse that just saved his life would become his reason to truly live again. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The water hit James Peterson like 1,000 ice needles, shocking his system as he plunged beneath the surface of the raging river. His lungs burned, desperate for air as the current pulled him deeper, tumbling him like a rag doll through the murky depths. In that moment, as consciousness began to slip away, time slowed. Memories flashed before him. Afghanistan, the explosion, the years of therapy, and now this. Was this how it would end? Not on a battlefield, but in the cold waters of the Blackwater River, miles from anyone who might help. James had come to the Montana wilderness seeking peace. After 3 tours of duty and an honorable discharge that followed an IED explosion that left both physical and invisible scars, he'd purchased a small cabin nestled against the foothills. The isolation was exactly what he needed. No loud noises to trigger his PTSD, no crowds to navigate, just the sounds of nature and the company of his own thoughts. That morning had started like any other. James woke before dawn, made his coffee, and sat on his porch watching the sun rise over the mountains. The nightmares had been particularly bad the night before, dreams of sand and blood and the faces of men he couldn't save. The river had always been his refuge on days like these. The steady rush of water over stone somehow calmed the chaos in his mind. He'd been following the riverbank for nearly 2 hours when he spotted the eagle's nest, high in a pine on the opposite shore. Without thinking, he stepped onto what appeared to be a solid shelf of rock jutting into the water, hoping for a better view. The stone, slick with moss and morning dew, gave way beneath his boot. One moment he was standing, the next he was falling, his head striking something hard before the cold current swept him away. Now, as he struggled against the powerful pull of the river, his military training kicked in. Don't panic, conserve energy, find the surface. But the blow to his head left him disoriented, and his heavy hiking boots dragged him down like anchors. His lungs screamed for air, and despite his best efforts, panic began to set in. The more he fought, the more energy he expended, and the river showed no mercy. Just as darkness began to close in around the edges of his vision, something solid brushed against him. A log, perhaps. A desperate hope flared as James reached out, his fingers grasping at anything that might save him. What he felt wasn't the rough bark of a fallen tree, but something smooth, warm, alive. With a powerful surge, James was suddenly thrust upward, breaking the surface with a desperate gasp. Water streamed from his face as he gulped in precious air, coughing and sputtering. Through blurred vision, he saw a flash of white beside him. A massive horse, its coat gleaming like fresh snow, swam powerfully against the current, its large body creating a buffer between James and the full force of the river. The animal's eyes, dark and intelligent, locked onto his. In that brief moment of connection, James felt something he couldn't explain, a recognition, an understanding. Then instinct took over. He reached out, his fingers tangling in the horse's flowing mane. The creature didn't flinch or try to pull away. Instead, it seemed to angle its body, making it easier for James to hold on. Together, they moved through the water, the horse swimming with powerful strokes toward the shoreline. James held on, his strength fading, trusting this unexpected savior to guide them to safety. When his boots finally scraped against the riverbed, he stumbled, falling to his knees in the shallows. The horse stood beside him, water cascading from its muscular body, its sides heaving with exertion. "Thank you," James whispered, the words inadequate for what had just occurred. The horse shook its magnificent head, sending droplets flying in all directions. It made no move to leave, instead watching James with those same intelligent eyes that had connected with his beneath the water. As his senses returned, James realized he recognized this animal, not personally, but he'd heard stories from locals about a wild white stallion that roamed the mountains. Some called him the ghost of Blackwater, a solitary creature that appeared and vanished like morning mist, avoiding humans and other horses alike. No one had ever reported coming close to him, let alone being touched by him. Yet here he stood, this legendary creature, having just saved a drowning man from certain death. James slowly rose to his feet, his clothes heavy with water, his body trembling from cold and adrenaline. The stallion took a step back but didn't flee. They regarded each other in silence, an unspoken current passing between them. "Where did you come from?" James asked softly, not expecting an answer. The horse's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice. "Were you watching me? Following me?" The questions hung in the air, unanswerable yet somehow important. A wave of dizziness suddenly washed over James. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of his injury and near drowning began to settle in. He touched the side of his head, his fingers coming away red with blood from where he'd struck it during the fall. The world tilted precariously, and he stumbled again, dropping to one knee. To his amazement, the white stallion moved closer, lowering its head to nudge gently at his shoulder. The gesture seemed almost human in its concern. James leaned against the horse's strong neck, drawing warmth and stability from the solid presence beside him. "I need to get back to my cabin," James murmured, more to himself than to the horse, but I'm not sure I can make it alone. His cabin was at least 3 miles upstream, and in his current condition, that distance seemed insurmountable. As if understanding, the stallion slowly knelt on its forelegs, lowering its body in a clear invitation. James stared in disbelief. Wild horses didn't behave this way. They didn't rescue drowning men, and they certainly didn't offer themselves as transportation afterward. Yet here was this magnificent creature kneeling before him, waiting. With trembling hands, James grasped the horse's mane and pulled himself onto its broad back. The stallion rose carefully, adjusting to the weight of its passenger before setting off along the riverbank. James held on loosely, trusting the animal beneath him. They moved at a steady walk, the horse picking its way carefully over uneven ground, always staying close to the water's edge, heading upstream toward James's cabin. The sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains by the time the small wooden structure came into view. The stallion stopped at the edge of the clearing, as if reluctant to approach the human dwelling. James slid from its back, his legs nearly buckling as they hit the ground. He steadied himself against the horse's flank. "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Just for a while." He needed medical attention, needed to clean his wound and change into dry clothes, but he feared that once he entered the cabin, this magical encounter would end, and the ghost of Blackwater would disappear back into legend. The stallion stood motionless, steam rising from its damp coat in the cooling evening air. Its eyes reflected the fading daylight, pools of wisdom and wildness that seemed to look straight through James to something beyond. Then, with a gentle nicker, it followed as James made his slow, painful way toward the cabin door. Inside the cabin, James moved with the mechanical precision that had been drilled into him during his military years. Even in his weakened state, with his head throbbing and his body aching from the river's assault, his training took over. First aid, dry clothes, assess the situation. He peeled off his soaked garments, wincing as the fabric clung to his cold skin, and quickly changed into dry flannel and jeans. Then he turned his attention to the gash on his temple. In the small bathroom mirror, his reflection startled him. Pale face, bloodshot eyes, the ugly red wound still seeping blood down the side of his face. He looked like a ghost himself. With careful fingers, he cleaned the cut, hissing as antiseptic made contact with raw flesh. The wound was deep but not dangerously so. Head injuries always bled profusely. He applied butterfly bandages to hold the edges together, wondering if he should make the long drive to town for stitches, but the thought of leaving now, with the white stallion possibly still outside, was unthinkable. James had seen enough wonders disappear when he turned his back. This one, he wasn't willing to lose. After swallowing a couple of painkillers, he filled a kettle and set it on the wood stove. His hands trembled slightly as he spooned coffee into a mug. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the familiar hollow feeling that followed moments of extreme danger. How many times had he felt this way in Afghanistan? That strange emptiness after cheating death, the mixture of gratitude and guilt that came with survival. He moved to the window, coffee forgotten, and peered out at the gathering dusk. Would the horse still be there, or had it already vanished back into the wilderness that had birthed the legend? To his amazement, the white shape remained at the edge of the clearing, grazing calmly as if it had nowhere else to be. Relief flooded through him, unexpected in its intensity. James stepped out onto the porch, his breath fogging in the cool evening air. The stallion's head lifted immediately, ears pricked forward, alert but not alarmed. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the distance, man and beast, both survivors, both outsiders in their own way. "Thank you," James said again, his voice carrying in the stillness. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. The horse nickered softly in response, a sound that seemed to resonate in James's chest. Without fully understanding why, James retreated into the cabin and returned with an apple from the bowl on his counter. He held it out, palm flat the way he'd been taught as a boy during rare visits to his uncle's farm. The stallion watched him, unmoving at first. Then, with deliberate steps, it approached, each hoof placed with precision, ready to flee at any sign of threat. When the horse finally reached him, James held his breath. This close, the animal was even more magnificent, at least 17 hands high with powerful shoulders and a deep chest. Not some delicate Arabian, but a draft horse or a draft cross, built for strength and endurance. The stallion's breath was warm against his palm as velvety lips carefully took the offered apple. James marveled at the gentleness from a creature of such size and power. "You're not really wild, are you?" James murmured, noticing now the faint scars around the horse's muzzle and chest. "Someone owned you once." The horse chewed thoughtfully, dark eyes fixed on James with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Did you escape? Or were you abandoned?" As if in answer, the stallion lowered its head, allowing James to see a faded brand partially hidden by the thick winter coat on its shoulder. The mark was old and unclear, but it confirmed James's suspicion. This was no truly wild horse, but one that had known human contact before choosing solitude. "Looks like we both left civilization behind," James said softly, cautiously reaching up to stroke the strong white neck. The horse allowed the touch, leaning slightly into his hand. "We both have our scars." Night was falling quickly now, the temperature dropping with the sun. James knew he should go inside, rest, deal with the aftermath of his near drowning, but the thought of closing the door on this moment, this connection, made something tighten in his chest. It had been so long since he'd felt anything but numb. "I don't suppose you'd consider staying the night, and," he asked, gesturing to the small lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. It wasn't much, just a roof and 3 walls where he stored firewood and tools, but it would offer some shelter from the wind. "It's the least I can offer after what you did." The stallion turned its head toward the structure, nostrils flaring as it considered. Then, to James's continued amazement, it walked deliberately toward the lean-to and ducked its head to enter. Inside, it pawed at the dirt floor, turned once in a circle, and then settled, folding its legs beneath its massive body. James stood speechless for a moment before a laugh escaped him, the first genuine laugh in longer than he could remember. "Well, all right then," he said. "Make yourself at home." He returned to the cabin only long enough to grab a spare blanket, which he draped over the horse's back. The stallion accepted this offering with the same dignity it had shown throughout their strange encounter. James found himself talking as he moved around the lean-to, clearing space, his voice low and steady. "I'm James, by the way. Former Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army. Not that you asked." He paused, running a hand along the horse's flank. "I should probably call you something. Ghost seems too obvious, and you're very much real." The horse's ear flicked back, listening. "How about Phantom?" "No, that's not right either." James thought for a moment. "Valor. That's what you showed today." The name seemed to settle in the air between them. The horse, Valor, blinked slowly, acceptance in the gesture. As James finally returned to his cabin, exhaustion crashed over him in waves. He managed to make it to his bed before his legs gave out, the events of the day catching up all at once. The pain in his head had dulled to a persistent throb, and his muscles ached from their battle with the river. But he was alive. He'd survived because a legendary horse had appeared exactly when and where he needed saving. Why? He whispered to the empty room. Why had Valor been there? Why save him, a broken soldier hiding from the world? The questions circled in his mind as sleep pulled him under. For the first time in years, James didn't dream of war. Instead, his unconscious mind filled with images of running water, of powerful hooves striking earth, of freedom found in open spaces, and throughout it all a presence beside him steady and unwavering. Outside in the lean-to, Valor kept watch through the night, ears occasionally flicking toward sounds in the forest beyond. But unlike countless nights before, the white stallion didn't vanish with the darkness. Instead, it remained, a silent guardian at the edge of one man's solitude, as if some unspoken pact had been sealed between them in the rushing waters of the river. Dawn arrived with a gentle persistence, pink light filtering through the cabin's curtainless windows. James woke with a start, momentarily disoriented, his head pounding. The events of the previous day crashed back into his consciousness. The fall, the river, the white stallion, Valor. Had it all been real? Or had his mind, damaged by war and isolation, finally created the companionship he'd been denying himself? He pushed himself up, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. Every part of him ached, testament to his battle with the current. The bandage on his temple was spotted with dried blood. Real enough then. But what about the horse? James moved to the window, his heart hammering with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Fear, perhaps. Fear that the magic of yesterday had vanished with the night. The lean-to was visible from where he stood, its entrance shadowed in the early morning light. Empty. A wave of disappointment washed over him, so intense it took his breath away. Of course the horse hadn't stayed. Why would it? Wild creatures didn't form attachments overnight, especially to broken men who could barely take care of themselves. He'd been a fool to hope. James turned away from the window, moving mechanically to start his morning routine. Coffee first, then check the wound, maybe try to eat something. His body felt leaden, each step an effort. The hollow feeling in his chest had nothing to do with hunger. As he filled the kettle, a sound from outside made him freeze. A soft whicker, followed by the unmistakable thud of heavy hooves on packed earth. James abandoned the kettle and rushed to the door, throwing it open with more force than he'd intended. There, standing in the clearing before his cabin, was Valor. The morning sun caught in his white coat, turning it to liquid gold. The stallion was grazing on the sparse grass, looking for all the world like he belonged there, like he'd always been there. When James appeared, he lifted his head, ears pricking forward in recognition. "You stayed," James breathed, relief flooding through him. He stepped out onto the porch, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance, yesterday's clothes rumpled from sleep, hair wild, face pale beneath his tan. Not that the horse would care. Valor approached with that same deliberate gait from the night before, dignified and cautious, yet somehow trusting. He stopped before the porch, exhaling a cloud of steam in the cool morning air. "I thought you'd gone," James admitted, descending the steps to stand before the massive animal. "I wouldn't have blamed you." Up close, in the clear light of day, James could see details he'd missed in the chaotic aftermath of his rescue. The stallion's coat, though predominantly white, had subtle dappling along his flanks. His eyes weren't black as they'd appeared, but a deep, rich brown, intelligent and assessing. And the scars, more visible now, told stories of a difficult past. A long, jagged mark ran down one shoulder, another across his chest. Old wounds, long healed but permanently etched into his hide. "You've seen some battles, haven't you?" James murmured, carefully reaching out to trace the scar on Valor's shoulder. The horse stood perfectly still, allowing the touch. "Yeah, me too." Almost without thinking, James rolled up his sleeve, revealing the web of scars that covered his left forearm and disappeared beneath his shirt, souvenirs from the IED that had ended his military career. "We match," he said with a wry smile. Valor lowered his head, gently nudging the exposed arm. The gesture was so gentle, so seemingly intentional, that James felt his throat tighten with emotion. He swallowed hard, pushing back against the sudden vulnerability. "Come on," he said, his voice gruff. "Let's get some breakfast." The morning passed in a surreal domestic routine. James brewed his coffee and ate a simple meal of oatmeal, all while Valor grazed nearby, occasionally wandering closer to observe James's activities with curious eyes. After eating, James inspected his wound again, changing the bandages and determining that while ugly, it wouldn't require a trip to town after all. "Lucky for me," he told Valor, who had wandered to the edge of the porch. "Nearest hospital is almost 2 hours away, and I hate hospitals." Valor snorted, tossing his head as if in agreement. "You don't like vets either, I bet," James said, smiling despite himself. "Can't say I blame you." As the morning warmed, James felt restless. He needed to move, to work through the soreness in his muscles before they locked up entirely. And he needed to do something for Valor. The horse had saved his life, after all. The least he could do was offer proper shelter and care for as long as the stallion chose to stay. "I've got an old shed about 50 yards behind the cabin," he told Valor as he pulled on his jacket. "Used to be a proper stable, according to the previous owner. Might need some work, but it's better than that lean-to if you're planning to stick around." Valor followed as James made his way around the cabin and through a stand of pine trees to where a weathered structure stood. It was larger than James had remembered, clearly designed to house at least 4 horses, with a small tack room attached. The roof was intact, but the door hung from one hinge and years of disuse had left the interior filled with debris. "Need some elbow grease," James observed, stepping carefully inside. "But the bones are good." For the next several hours, James worked steadily, clearing out old leaves and branches, sweeping cobwebs from corners, rehanging the door. Valor remained close by, sometimes watching from the doorway, sometimes wandering off to graze, but always returning. Occasionally he'd bring James small objects, a fallen branch, once an old horseshoe that must have been buried in the dirt for years, as if offering his own contribution to the renovation. By midday, sweat soaked through James's shirt despite the cool air, and his muscles burned with healthy exertion rather than the ache of yesterday's trauma. The stable was far from perfect, but it was clean and secure, with a fresh layer of pine needles covering the earthen floor. "What do you think?" James asked, standing back to survey his work. 5 stars? Valor entered cautiously, sniffing each corner before walking a complete circuit of the interior. Then, just as he had in the lean-to the night before, he pawed at the ground, turned once and settled down with a contented sigh. James laughed, the sound echoing in the newly cleared space. "I'll take that as approval." As he watched Valor make himself comfortable, a thought struck James. If the stallion truly had been domesticated once, as the brand and his behavior suggested, then someone somewhere might be looking for him. Or worse, might have legal claim to him. The idea sent an unexpected jolt of anxiety through James's chest. "You're not stolen property, are you?" he asked, only half joking. "Because I'm not looking to add horse thief to my resume." Valor merely blinked those wise brown eyes, offering no clarification on his legal status. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I know. Not like you can tell me your life story." He paused, considering. "But maybe someone in town might know something about you. The ghost of Blackwater can't have appeared out of nowhere." The decision to venture into town wasn't made lightly. James avoided people when possible, finding the noise and unpredictability of social interaction more exhausting than physical labor. But the mystery of Valor, and the strange connection he felt to the horse, compelled him to make the trip. If nothing else, he needed supplies if he was going to host a 17-hand house guest indefinitely. "I'll be back before dark," he promised, giving Valor's neck a final pat. "Try not to disappear on me again, all right?" The town of Riverbrook was little more than a collection of weathered buildings arranged around a single main street. With just under 500 permanent residents, it wasn't the sort of place that appeared on maps, but it served as the hub for the surrounding ranches and cabins scattered throughout the valley. James had been there exactly 3 times since moving to his cabin 6 months ago, once to sign the final paperwork, once for winter supplies, and once when his truck needed parts. Each visit had been brief, purposeful, and solitary. As he guided his aging pickup down the rutted road that led to town, James rehearsed what he would say. How exactly does one ask about a legendary white horse without sounding completely unhinged? The wound on his temple, still angry and obvious beneath its fresh bandage, would lend credibility to his near-drowning story, but the rest. A wild horse that rescued him from the river and then decided to take up residence in his renovated stable. He could already imagine the sideways glances, the whispered comments when he turned away. The truck rattled over the wooden bridge that marked the town's unofficial boundary. A few pedestrians moved along the sidewalks, bundled against the spring chill. James parked in front of the general store, taking a moment to steel himself before stepping out into the open. His heart rate ticked upward, a familiar response to public spaces that he'd learned to manage but never quite overcome. The bell above the door jingled as he entered Walsh's general store, announcing his presence to the handful of customers browsing the aisles. James nodded stiffly at an elderly couple who glanced his way, then made for the counter where Dan Walsh, the proprietor, was sorting through a box of fishing lures. "Well, look who's back among the living," Dan said by way of greeting. At 60-something, with steel-gray hair and a perpetual sunburn, he was the closest thing to a friend James had made since moving to the area. "Beginning to think you'd gone full hermit on us." "Just about," James replied with a tight smile. He began listing the supplies he needed: feed appropriate for horses, some basic grooming tools, a simple halter. Dan's bushy eyebrows climbed higher with each item. "Didn't know you were a horseman," he commented, scribbling the order on a pad. "When did this happen?" James touched the bandage on his temple, wincing slightly for effect. "Yesterday, actually. It's kind of a long story." Dan leaned forward on the counter, eyes twinkling. "Son, in case you haven't noticed, we specialize in long stories around here. It's about the only entertainment we get." So James told him, an edited version that emphasized his fall and near drowning while downplaying the more fantastical elements of his rescue. He described Valor as a white horse that showed up, rather than a mythical creature that had deliberately saved his life. "Wait a minute," Dan interrupted, holding up a weathered hand. "This horse, big white fella, about 17 hands, scars on his chest and shoulder." James felt a jolt of surprise. "You know him?" Dan scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Maybe. Sounds like you've met our local legend. Folks around here call him the Ghost of Blackwater. Been roaming these parts for about 3 years now. Some say he's the spirit of a cavalry horse from the old days." Dan chuckled. "Of course, that's just Elmer Johnson talking after his 5th whiskey down at the Pine Lodge." "Do you know where he came from?" James pressed. "He's got a brand, but it's old, and I can't make it out clearly." "There are stories," Dan said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Ranch about 60 miles north of here, Rockingham, had a big Percheron thoroughbred cross that disappeared during that bad blizzard in 22. Valuable animal, champion draft puller and all that. Owner spent a small fortune trying to find him. Some say the ghost is that horse, but no one's ever gotten close enough to confirm it." The bell above the door jingled again, and Dan straightened up, his attention shifting to the newcomer. James turned to see a tall man in a black cowboy hat and sheepskin jacket stepping into the store. Something in Dan's expression changed. A subtle tightening around the eyes, a forced casualness that immediately put James on alert. "Afternoon, Mitchell," Dan called. The man, Mitchell, nodded curtly. He had the leathery, wind-burned face of someone who spent his life outdoors, with pale eyes that took in everything without revealing anything in return. Those eyes landed on James, assessing him in one sweeping glance before moving on. "Walsh," he replied, his voice gruff. "Just need some fence staples and a new pair of work gloves." "Aisle 3 for the gloves," Dan directed. "I'll get the staples from the back." As Dan disappeared through a door behind the counter, an uncomfortable silence fell. James busied himself examining a rack of local maps, acutely aware of Mitchell's presence as the man moved through the store. Years of combat had honed his situational awareness to razor sharpness, and something about Mitchell triggered it. Nothing concrete, just the instinctive recognition of a potential threat. Dan returned with a box of staples, ringing up Mitchell's purchases with professional politeness that didn't quite reach his eyes. The transaction completed, Mitchell turned to leave, pausing by the door to glance back at James. "Don't think we've met," he said. "You must be the vet who bought the old Holloway place up by the river." James nodded, surprised to be known. "James Peterson. Carl Mitchell. I manage the Rockingham." He gestured to the bandage on James's temple. "Looks like you had some trouble." "Fell in the river," James replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Got lucky." Mitchell's pale gaze held his for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Lucky indeed. Well, welcome to the area, Peterson. Hope that wound heals up quick." The bell jingled again as he left, and James felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. "Friendly guy," he commented dryly. Dan snorted. "Carl Mitchell's about as friendly as a rattlesnake with a toothache. Been running the Rockingham since old man Miller's health started failing. Word is he's got his eye on owning it outright someday." James filed this information away, returning to the counter to complete his purchase. By the time he'd loaded his supplies into the truck and made a quick stop at the small local diner for takeout, the afternoon was waning. He was eager to return to his cabin, to check on Valor and process what he'd learned. The drive back seemed longer, his mind churning with questions. If Valor was indeed the missing champion from the Rockingham, what did that mean for their unusual friendship? The horse had clearly chosen freedom over returning to his former home. But what if someone from the Rockingham spotted Valor at James's cabin? Would they try to reclaim him? As the truck crested the final hill before his turnoff, James made a decision. He would keep Valor's presence quiet for now, learn more about the situation, and, most importantly, let the horse himself decide where he wanted to be. After all, Valor had rescued him, not the other way around. He owed the stallion at least that much autonomy. The sun was setting by the time James pulled up to his cabin, casting long shadows across the clearing. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, scanning the property for any sign of Valor. The stable was empty, the lean-to unoccupied. His heart sank. Had the horse left after all? Then, from the tree line at the edge of the property, a flash of white caught his eye. Valor emerged from the shadows, moving toward the truck with that same deliberate gait that somehow managed to convey both caution and confidence. The sight filled James with a relief so profound it almost embarrassed him. "Hey there," he said softly as he climbed out of the truck. "Thought maybe you'd moved on." Valor nickered in greeting, coming close enough to sniff curiously at the bags James was unloading. When the horse's nose bumped against the container holding James's diner takeout, he laughed. "Dinner's for me, but I got something for you too." He reached into one of the bags and pulled out an apple, an impulse purchase from a barrel near the store's register. "Peace offering for leaving you alone all day." Valor accepted the fruit with the same gentleness he'd shown before, and James felt something settle inside him. Whatever complications tomorrow might bring, tonight they were just two battered souls finding unexpected companionship in a world that hadn't always been kind to either of them. The nightmare came just before dawn. It always did. That darkest hour when the body's defenses were at their lowest. James was back in Afghanistan, dust filling his lungs, the weight of his gear crushing his chest. The road stretched before him, seemingly empty, but his instincts screamed danger. He tried to call out to his team, to warn them, but no sound emerged. Then the flash, the concussive force, the world turning sideways, and the screams, always the screams. James woke gasping, drenched in sweat. The sheets twisted around him like restraints. For a disorienting moment, he was still there, still trapped in the aftermath of the explosion. His hand reached automatically for the sidearm he no longer kept beside his bed, finding only empty space. A sound from outside, not gunfire, not screaming, but a gentle rhythmic noise, slowly pulled him back to reality. The cabin, Montana, present day, safe. He forced himself to breathe, counting silently the way his therapist had taught him. 4 counts in, hold for 7, 8 counts out. Repeat. When his heart rate had slowed to something approaching normal, James pushed himself up and moved to the window. Dawn was just breaking, pale light seeping into the gray world outside. And there, in the clearing before the cabin, was Valor. The white stallion was running in wide circles, mane and tail flying, hooves striking the earth in the cadence that had penetrated James's nightmare. Not gunfire, not danger, just a horse, exercising in the morning chill. James watched, transfixed. Valor moved with a power and grace that belied his massive size, muscles rippling beneath his white coat. His circles weren't random but precise, perfectly round as if he were running on an invisible track. Training, James realized. This was a pattern drilled into him by years of human guidance. Without conscious decision, James pulled on clothes and boots and stepped out onto the porch. The cool morning air raised goosebumps on his skin, chasing away the last tendrils of the nightmare. Valor, sensing his presence, slowed and turned toward the cabin. "Morning," James called, his voice still rough from sleep. "Early riser, huh?" The horse approached, steam rising from his body in the cool air. Up close, the evidence of his exertion was clear. His sides heaving slightly, nostrils flared, a light sheen of sweat making his white coat gleam in the early light. James reached out, running a hand along Valor's strong neck. "You were showing off," he observed with a small smile. "Those are dressage circles. Someone trained you pretty extensively." Valor nudged James's shoulder, nearly knocking him back a step. The familiar gesture somehow felt different this morning, like a deliberate attempt to draw James out of the dark cloud that still clung to him after the nightmare. "I'm all right," James assured him, though the tremor in his hands belied his words. "Bad dream, that's all." The horse regarded him steadily, those intelligent eyes seeming to look straight through James's defenses. It was unnerving, that gaze, like being sized up by another veteran, someone who knew exactly what the scars looked like because they carried identical ones. "Guess we both had a rough night," James said, noticing now the disturbed earth near the stable. Valor had been restless too, it seemed. "Tell you what, let's try out some of that fancy equipment I bought yesterday. Might do us both some good to keep busy." After a quick breakfast for himself and a measure of oats for Valor, purchased on Dan Walsh's recommendation, James brought out the halter and lead rope he'd bought in town. He held them up for Valor's inspection. "You remember these, I bet," James said. "What do you say? Want to show me what you know?" To his amazement, Valor lowered his head in clear invitation, making it easy for James to slip the halter on. The stallion stood perfectly still as James adjusted the straps, familiar with the routine in a way that confirmed his past as a trained show horse. "Good boy," James murmured, running a hand along Valor's jaw. "Let's see what else you remember." Over the next hour, James discovered that Valor wasn't just trained, he was exceptional. The stallion responded to the slightest pressure on the lead, pivoting on his hind legs, backing up and moving sideways with a precision that spoke of years of careful training. He clearly knew voice commands as well, ears pricking forward attentively at each word James spoke. "Trot," James said experimentally, and Valor immediately moved into a perfect collected trot beside him, maintaining exactly the right distance. "Impressive," James commented, bringing the horse to a halt with a gentle "whoa" and pressure on the lead. "Someone spent a lot of time with you." As they worked together in the clearing, James found his mind clearing, the residual tension from the nightmare draining away. There was something therapeutic about this communication with Valor, this dance of trust and understanding that required his full attention. For the first time in years, he felt fully present, anchored in the moment rather than torn between past trauma and future anxiety. After exercising Valor, James retrieved the grooming tools he'd purchased: a curry comb, a dandy brush, and a soft body brush. Again, Valor showed his training, standing perfectly still as James began working the curry comb in circular motions across his coat, loosening dirt and stimulating circulation. As James worked his way down Valor's left shoulder, his fingers traced the ridge of the old scar there. In the full morning light, he could see that it wasn't a single injury, but multiple small ones, clustered together in a pattern that suddenly made sense to him. "Barbed wire," he murmured. "You got caught in a fence, didn't you? During that blizzard Dan mentioned, maybe." Valor shifted slightly, as if the memory itself caused discomfort. James moved on, continuing the grooming with gentle, methodical strokes. When he reached the horse's hindquarters, he noticed something that had been hidden by dirt and winter coat. Another mark, this one deliberate. The brand that he'd glimpsed before was now clearly visible. A stylized RM inside a circle. "Rockingham," James said softly. "So it's true." Valor was indeed the missing champion from Mitchell's ranch. The confirmation brought a mixture of emotions: concern about what this might mean for Valor's future, but also a deeper understanding of the horse's history. He'd been a prized show animal, valued for his performance rather than himself. Then something had happened: the blizzard, the barbed wire, and Valor had chosen freedom over returning to that life. Just as James had chosen isolation over rejoining a society that couldn't understand what he'd been through. The parallel wasn't lost on James. Neither of them had truly belonged in the worlds they'd left behind. Both had sought solitude as a balm for their wounds, and somehow, against all odds, they'd found each other. "You know," James said as he worked the soft brush over Valor's coat in long, finishing strokes, "I haven't had a morning this good in a long time. Usually, after a nightmare, I'm useless for hours, sometimes days." Valor turned his great head, regarding James with that steady gaze. "Don't suppose you'd want to try riding?" James asked impulsively. He hadn't been on a horse since he was a teenager, visiting his uncle's farm during summer breaks, but something about Valor made him want to try again, to experience that particular freedom that came from moving as one with such a powerful creature. As if in answer, Valor lowered his head and gave a soft nicker that James chose to interpret as agreement. "We'll need a saddle," James mused, patting Valor's neck, "and I should probably brush up on my riding skills before climbing on a champion. But maybe someday soon." The idea took hold in his mind, growing stronger as the day progressed. James found himself making mental notes of things he'd need, skills he should review. For the first time in years, he was looking forward rather than back, planning for something beyond basic survival. After completing the grooming, James released Valor to graze while he turned his attention to the cabin. He worked steadily through the day, repairing a loose board on the porch, cutting more firewood, and cleaning the Spartan interior. All the while, Valor remained nearby, occasionally wandering off to explore but always returning to check on James's progress. By late afternoon, exhaustion, the good kind born of physical work rather than emotional drainage, began to set in. James sat on the porch steps watching as shadows lengthened across the clearing. Valor grazed peacefully a few yards away, his white coat glowing in the golden light of approaching sunset. "Not a bad day, all things considered," James said to the horse, to himself, to the wilderness around them. For once, the statement wasn't tinged with irony or forced positivity. It had genuinely been a good day. The sound of an approaching vehicle jolted James awake the next morning. He'd been dozing in the old rocking chair on his porch, coffee gone cold beside him, watching Valor graze in the dewy grass of early morning. The rumble of an engine was so out of place in his secluded world that it took him a moment to process what he was hearing. Valor's head shot up, ears pricked toward the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. A moment later, the horse retreated to the tree line with a speed that startled James. Clearly, Valor's instinct to avoid humans hadn't completely vanished despite their growing bond. James rose to his feet, scanning the road until a battered green pickup came into view, bouncing over the uneven terrain. He didn't recognize the vehicle, and wariness immediately replaced his peaceful mood. Visitors were rare enough to be suspicious, especially unannounced ones. The truck pulled up next to James's own vehicle and stopped, the engine cutting off abruptly. A woman emerged, tall and lean, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. She wore jeans, well-worn boots, and a denim jacket with leather patches on the elbows. Mid-50s, James guessed, though her tanned face made exact age difficult to determine. "Mr. Peterson," she called, walking toward the porch with confident strides. "I'm Elaine Miller." The name connected immediately in James's mind. Miller, as in Rockingham M Ranch, the owner that Carl Mitchell worked for. His guard went up further. "What can I do for you, Ms. Miller?" James asked, not moving from his position on the porch. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at him with clear, appraising eyes. "Dan Walsh told me about your accident at the river. Thought I'd check in, neighbor to neighbor. It's what we do out here." James doubted that was her only reason for the 30-mile drive to his isolated cabin, but he nodded anyway. "I appreciate the concern. I'm fine, as you can see." "That's quite a gash," she observed, gesturing to the wound on his temple. "Looks worse than it is." Elaine smiled slightly. I've raised 3 boys and buried a husband. I know how men downplay injuries. She glanced around the property, her gaze lingering on the recently cleaned stable. Dan also mentioned you were asking about a white horse. And there it was. James kept his expression neutral. Just curious about local legends, the ghost of Blackwater, they call him. Elaine's smile faded. That's right. Has some basis in fact, that legend. She hesitated, then asked directly, have you seen him? James considered his options. Lying outright didn't sit well with him, but revealing Valor's presence might put the horse in danger of being reclaimed. He settled for a partial truth. Thought I might have caught a glimpse of something white near the river before I fell in. Hard to be sure. Elaine studied him for a long moment, and James had the distinct impression she was deciding whether to believe him. Finally, she nodded slowly. That white horse you might have seen. His name is Maximilian. Max for short. He's, or was, the pride of Rockingham. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. May I come up? James stepped aside, allowing her onto the porch. Elaine unfolded the paper, revealing a faded photograph. In it, a magnificent white stallion stood in a show ring, festooned with ribbons, a much younger Elaine holding his lead. This was taken 6 years ago at the state fair, she explained. Max won grand champion in the draft horse division, 3rd year running. James studied the photo. The horse was unmistakably Valor, the same intelligent eyes, the same powerful build. But his coat gleamed with meticulous grooming, his mane braided with show ribbons, his stance proud but somehow different, more constrained perhaps. Beautiful animal, James said carefully. He was more than that, Elaine replied, a note of genuine loss in her voice. Max was special. My husband Richard trained him from a colt. They had a connection like I've never seen before or since. She took the photo back, looking at it with a mixture of fondness and sadness. When Richard died of a heart attack 4 years ago, Max was the only thing that kept me going. Sounds silly, maybe, to find comfort in a horse, but it doesn't sound silly at all, James said quietly. Elaine gave him a grateful look. 3 years ago, we had that terrible blizzard. Worst in 30 years, they said. Max broke out of the stable. He'd never done that before. We searched for weeks, found tracks leading into the national forest, and then nothing. Her voice wavered slightly. Most assumed he died in the storm, but there have been sightings over the years. The ghost of Blackwater. And you think he's still alive? James stated rather than asked. I know he is. Elaine's certainty was absolute. Max is a survivor, and more than that, he's smart. Smarter than most horses have any right to be. James thought of Valor's intelligent eyes, his seemingly deliberate actions. Why are you telling me this? Elaine tucked the photo away. Because if you do see him, Mr. Peterson, I'd appreciate knowing he's okay. I'm not asking you to catch him or even approach him. Just let me know. She paused, then added, and maybe keep the information to yourself otherwise. Why's that? James asked, though he suspected he knew. Carl Mitchell, my ranch manager, has different ideas about Max. Thinks we should bring him back to competition, recoup our investment. There was a hint of steel in her voice. But after 3 years in the wild, that's not what Max needs, even if we could catch him, which many have tried and failed to do. So what do you want for him? James asked, genuinely curious. Elaine looked out over the clearing toward the tree line where Valor had disappeared. I just want to know he's okay, that he's found some peace out there. She turned back to James, like some of us are trying to do. The pointed comment made it clear she knew something about James's background, likely from town gossip. Ex-military, keeps to himself, bought the most isolated property available. It wasn't hard to fill in the blanks. "I'll keep an eye out," James promised. It wasn't exactly a lie. "If I see your Max, I'll let you know." "Thank you." Elaine reached into her pocket again and handed him a business card with the Rockingham logo and her phone number. "My direct line, not the ranch office." As she turned to leave, a movement in the trees caught James's eye. Valor had emerged slightly from his hiding place, just enough to observe them. The horse's gaze seemed fixed on Elaine, his posture alert but not frightened. If Elaine noticed, she gave no indication. "One more thing, Mr. Peterson," she said as she reached her truck. "Mitchell sometimes rides the boundaries of properties around here, looking for strays, or for Max. If he comes by, you don't owe him any information. It's your land." With that warning delivered, she climbed into her truck and drove away. James watched until the vehicle disappeared down the rutted road, then turned toward the tree line. "You can come out now," he called. "She's gone." Slowly, Valor emerged from the shadows, his white coat catching the morning sun. He approached cautiously, stopping to sniff the air where Elaine had stood. James wondered what the horse made of this visitor from his past life. "So you're Maximilian," James said softly. "Grand champion. Quite the pedigree you've been hiding." Valor, or Max, nudged James's shoulder in what had become their familiar greeting. There was something almost apologetic in the gesture, as if the horse were acknowledging his deception. James laughed despite himself. "Don't worry. Your secret's safe with me." He looked down at the business card in his hand, turning it over thoughtfully. "But it seems like you've got at least one person back at the ranch who actually cares about you, as a friend, not just a prize." Valor's ears flicked back and forth, taking in James's words. "She seems decent," James continued, "not like Mitchell." He remembered the cold assessment in the ranch manager's eyes when they'd met at the general store. No, Mitchell wasn't someone he'd trust with a goldfish, let alone a remarkable creature like Valor. "Guess we've both got decisions to make," James murmured, tucking the card into his pocket. "For now, though, how about we enjoy the day? I was thinking of riding down to the river, if you're willing." Valor's response was to walk deliberately to the porch steps and wait expectantly, as if to say, "What are we waiting for?" The simple normality of the moment, a man and his horse preparing for a morning ride, struck James with unexpected force. How long had it been since anything in his life had felt normal? Yet here he was, planning a ride with a champion draft horse that had saved him from drowning and then decided to stay. Normal wasn't exactly the right word, but it was something even better. It was real. With no proper saddle or bridle, James had to improvise. He found an old blanket in the cabin, folded it carefully and secured it with a length of soft rope he'd purchased in town. It wasn't ideal, but Valor, Max, he corrected himself mentally, seemed unfazed by the makeshift equipment. The horse stood patiently as James adjusted everything, only shifting slightly when the rope was pulled too tight. "Sorry about that," James murmured, loosening the tension. "Been a while since I've done this." His last time on horseback had been during leave nearly 7 years ago now. He and some buddies had rented horses for a trail ride in Kentucky. James remembered laughing that day, feeling normal for a few precious hours before returning to deployment, before the IED, before everything changed. He pushed the memories away, focusing instead on the present moment, the solid warmth of Valor beneath his hands, the sweet smell of hay and horse, the quiet morning air around them. "All right," James said, patting Valor's neck. Moment of truth. With a deep breath, he placed his foot on a nearby stump and swung himself onto Valor's back. The horse remained perfectly still, though his ears swiveled back to track James's movements. Once seated on the folded blanket, James took a moment to find his balance. The horse's broad back was different from the quarter horses he'd ridden in the past, wider, more substantial. "You good?" he asked, leaning forward to stroke Valor's neck. The horse snorted softly, which James chose to interpret as affirmation. "All right then, let's take it slow." With gentle pressure from his legs, James signaled Valor to walk. The response was immediate and smooth, a testament to the horse's training. They moved across the clearing and toward the path that led to the river, Valor's hooves making soft thuds against the earth. The sensation of riding again after so many years sent a rush of emotions through James. There was the childlike joy he remembered, the thrill of moving as one with such a powerful creature. But there was something else too, a sense of connection he hadn't expected. Each step Valor took seemed deliberate, careful, as if the horse understood James's nervousness and was doing his best to make the experience comfortable. As they reached the trail proper, Valor's ears pricked forward, his stride lengthening slightly with enthusiasm. James laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuineness. "Eager, aren't you? All right, let's pick it up a bit." With another gentle squeeze, he encouraged Valor into a trot. The transition was flawless, the gait steady, and even despite the uneven terrain. James adjusted his posture, muscle memory returning as he moved with the rhythm rather than fighting it. The forest opened around them, sunlight filtering through the pine canopy, the scent of warm earth and growing things filling the air. Birds called from the branches above, and once a deer bolted across the path ahead, white tail flashing as it disappeared into the underbrush. Valor watched it go, alert but unperturbed. As they approached the river, the trail widened, allowing for a faster pace. James hesitated only briefly before giving Valor the signal to canter. The horse responded with enthusiasm, powerful hindquarters driving them forward in a smooth, rolling gait that ate up the distance. The exhilaration was immediate, wind in his face, the rhythmic thunder of hooves, the world blurring slightly at the edges. For the first time in years, James felt something like freedom. Not the isolated freedom of his cabin, which was really just another form of confinement, but true liberation. In this moment, moving as one with Valor, he wasn't defined by his trauma or his past. He simply was. When they reached the riverbank, James brought Valor to a halt, both of them breathing harder from the run. The water flowed past, sunlight dancing on its surface, so different from the raging torrent that had nearly claimed James's life just days before. "This is where it happened," he said, patting Valor's neck. "Where you found me." The horse turned his head slightly, dark eye regarding James with that uncanny intelligence. Then he lowered his head to drink from the clear water. James dismounted, his legs slightly shaky from the unaccustomed exercise. He let Valor drink while he walked a few paces along the bank, identifying the spot where he'd fallen in. The rock shelf that had given way was visible now, a treacherous lip of stone that extended over the water. "I should have known better," he said, more to himself than to Valor. "We were trained to identify unsafe terrain, to never proceed without proper assessment." He laughed without humor. "Guess some lessons don't stick when you're back in the civilian world." Valor raised his head, water dripping from his muzzle, and walked over to stand beside James. The horse nudged his shoulder gently, as if offering comfort. "I was a good soldier," James continued, the words coming easier than they ever had with the therapists at the VA. "Not the best, maybe, but solid. Reliable. The guys in my unit used to call me Steady Pete. Always calm under pressure, always thinking 3 steps ahead." He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if searching for something in the lines of his palms. "Until the day I wasn't." The memories surfaced, sharper than they had been in the nightmare. The routine patrol, the strange absence of civilians that should have been his first warning, the glint of metal half buried in the dirt that he spotted a moment too late. The explosion, the screaming, the blood. So much blood. 2 men in my unit died that day, James said quietly. 3 others wounded, including me. And I was the one who should have seen it coming. Valor pressed closer, his warm body a solid presence against James's side. The simple animal comfort anchored him, preventing the memories from pulling him under completely. Afterward, they told me it wasn't my fault, that IEDs are designed to be hidden, that no one could have spotted it in time. They gave me a Purple Heart and an honorable discharge and sent me to therapy. James shook his head. But they don't understand what it's like to live with it, to know that if you'd just been a little more alert, a little more careful. He trailed off, realizing he was talking to a horse about things he'd never fully articulated to another human being. Yet something about Valor's presence made it feel right. The horse listened without judgment, without platitudes or attempts to fix him. He simply stood there, offering silent companionship. "Anyway," James said, pulling himself back to the present with an effort, "that's why I'm out here. Couldn't handle being around people anymore. All the noise, the expectations, the constant reminders." He gestured vaguely at the wilderness around them. "Out here, I don't have to explain anything. I don't have to pretend I'm okay when I'm not." Valor nickered softly, then dipped his head to crop at the grass along the riverbank. The simple, natural action was somehow comforting, life continuing regardless of human trauma. James watched the horse for a moment, then turned to look back at the river. The water that had nearly killed him flowed on, indifferent to human concerns. Upstream, downstream, it was all the same to the river. It didn't dwell on what had happened yesterday or worry about tomorrow. It simply was. Maybe there was wisdom in that. Not forgetting, James knew he would never forget, but learning to flow around the obstacles rather than being caught in endless eddies of regret and guilt. He looked at Valor, peacefully grazing nearby, and felt a surge of gratitude so intense it was almost painful. This horse, this remarkable, intelligent creature, had not only saved his life, but was somehow helping him find a way back to himself. "Ready to head back?" James asked, approaching Valor with the rope halter in hand. The horse raised his head, regarding James with those knowing eyes, then lowered it again in clear invitation. As James prepared to mount, he felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place that had been scattered for too long. They took the return journey slower, both content to savor the forest's quiet beauty. By the time the cabin came into view, James had made a decision. Whatever Valor's past, whatever claims others might make on him, the horse deserved the freedom to choose his own path forward, just as James himself did. The next 3 days fell into a routine that gave James more peace than he'd known in years. Each morning began with Valor exercising himself in the clearing, those perfect circles that spoke of his training as a show horse. Then breakfast, oats and fresh water for Valor, coffee and whatever simple meal James could put together for himself. Afterward came grooming, the methodical process becoming a meditation of sorts for both of them. In the afternoons, they explored the surrounding wilderness, James becoming more confident in his riding with each passing hour. Valor seemed to delight in showing him hidden meadows and secluded streams, places that felt untouched by human presence. In these quiet sanctuaries, James found himself talking more freely than he ever had before, about his childhood in Ohio, his years in the Army, his struggles since returning home. Valor listened with those attentive ears and intelligent eyes, offering silent companionship that somehow eased the weight James had carried for so long. The nightmares didn't stop entirely, but they lost some of their power. When James woke, gasping in the darkest hours, the knowledge that Valor was nearby, a steady, calming presence, helped him find his way back to sleep more quickly than any medication ever had. On the 4th morning, James was in the stable adding fresh bedding when he heard Valor's warning snort from outside. The horse had been grazing nearby but now stood alert, ears pricked toward the road, nostrils flared. A moment later, James caught the distant sound of an approaching engine. Company again. he murmured, setting aside the pitchfork. "Go on if you want to hide." But Valor remained where he was, though his muscles tensed visibly beneath his white coat. The sound grew louder, not a car or truck this time, but the distinctive growl of an ATV. James stepped out of the stable just as the vehicle crested the final rise and entered the clearing. Carl Mitchell sat astride the four-wheeler, dust coating his black cowboy hat and denim jacket. He cut the engine and dismounted in one fluid motion, removing his sunglasses to reveal those pale, assessing eyes James remembered from their brief encounter at Walsh's store. "Peterson," Mitchell called, his gaze moving past James to fix on Valor. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be damned." "Mitchell," James acknowledged, moving to stand between the man and the horse. "Didn't realize I was expecting visitors." Mitchell took a step forward, his attention still on Valor. "That's because you weren't. I've been checking the properties that border the forest, looking for strays." His smile widened. "Looks like I found one." "He's not a stray," James replied, his voice level despite the tension building in his chest. "He's mine." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "Is that right? Because that horse looks an awful lot like a valuable piece of Rockingham property. Maximilian, 3-time grand champion draft puller, worth close to $30,000. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Got the registration papers right here, with a detailed description. White Percheron thoroughbred cross, 16 3 hands high, with a distinctive whorl pattern on his chest and the Rockingham M brand on his left hindquarter." James felt Valor shift behind him, moving closer as if seeking protection. The irony wasn't lost on him, the powerful animal who had saved his life now looking to him for safety. "That may be," James conceded, "but he's been living wild for 3 years. And he chose to come here." Mitchell's eyes hardened. "Horses don't choose, Peterson. They're animals, property." He gestured toward Valor with a casual possessiveness that made James's jaw tighten. "That's an expensive investment standing there. Mrs. Miller might have given up on finding him, but I haven't. The ranch needs the money he can bring in competitions, or at least as a stud." "Mrs. Miller was here a few days ago," James said, watching Mitchell's expression carefully. "She seemed to have different ideas about what's best for Maximilian." A flicker of surprise crossed Mitchell's face, quickly replaced by calculation. "Elaine's a soft touch when it comes to that horse. Too much sentiment, not enough business sense. Why do you think the ranch is struggling?" He shook his head. "Doesn't matter what she told you. I manage the Rockingham operations, and that includes recovering valuable assets." Mitchell took another step forward, and James felt something shift inside him, a cold, familiar clarity that had served him well in combat situations. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," James said quietly. "This is private property." Mitchell stopped, seeming to register the change in James's demeanor. For a moment, the ranch manager assessed him with newfound wariness, taking in the steel that had entered his voice, the coiled readiness in his stance. "Look, Peterson," Mitchell said, his tone shifting to something more reasonable. "I understand you might have formed an attachment, but legally speaking, that horse belongs to Rockingham M Ranch. You're harboring stolen property." "Stolen?" James repeated. "From what I heard, he escaped during a blizzard. Survived on his own for 3 years. That doesn't sound like theft to me." "The law doesn't care about the circumstances," Mitchell insisted. "His registration and brand are clear. I could come back with the sheriff, make this official. Is that what you want?" The threat hung in the air between them. James considered his options, aware of Valor's warm breath on his shoulder, the horse's presence a steady reminder of what was at stake. "Tell you what," James said finally, "I'll call Mrs. Miller directly. Since she owns the ranch, her word should settle this. If she wants Maximilian returned, we can discuss it then. Mitchell's expression darkened. This isn't necessary. I represent the ranch and all. I'd prefer to hear it from the owner, James interrupted firmly. Unless there's some reason you don't want me speaking with her. The question hit its mark. Mitchell's face flushed with barely contained anger, but he made a visible effort to control himself. Fine, call her, but the outcome will be the same. That horse is coming back to Rockingham, one way or another. He turned and stalked back to his ATV, the set of his shoulders rigid with frustration. As he swung onto the seat, he called back, "I'll be watching this property, Peterson. Don't get any ideas about disappearing with that horse." The engine roared to life, and Mitchell spun the vehicle around, spraying dirt and gravel as he accelerated back down the road. James watched until he disappeared from sight, the dust cloud slowly settling in his wake. Only when the sound of the engine had faded completely did James allow his shoulders to relax. He turned to Valor, who had remained remarkably calm throughout the confrontation. "Well, that complicates things," James sighed, reaching up to stroke the horse's muscular neck. "Sorry about that. Seems like your past isn't quite ready to let go." Valor nudged him gently, dark eyes somehow conveying understanding. The gesture brought a slight smile to James's face, despite the worry settling in his gut. "Don't worry," he promised softly. "I meant what I said before. This is your choice, not his, not anyone's but yours." As he spoke the words, James realized he was making a promise he might not be able to keep. Mitchell didn't strike him as the type to respect a horse's preferences, or a reclusive veteran's property rights for that matter. If the man was determined to reclaim Valor by legal means or otherwise, James would need to be prepared. He glanced at the cabin, thinking of Elaine Miller's business card still tucked in his jacket pocket. That call needed to happen sooner rather than later, but first he had preparations to make. Years in the military had taught him to always plan for contingencies, to secure his position against potential threats. "Come on," he said to Valor, leading the horse toward the stable. "Let's get you settled somewhere less visible. I think we both could use a little strategic repositioning." James spent the rest of the morning on high alert, moving Valor to the back stable that was hidden from the main road by a stand of pines. The horse seemed to understand the need for caution, following James's instructions with an attentiveness that continued to amaze him. Once Valor was settled with fresh water and feed, James returned to the cabin and retrieved Elaine Miller's business card from his jacket pocket. He stared at the number, thumb hovering over his phone's keypad. The call could go either way. Elaine had seemed genuinely concerned for Valor's welfare during her visit, but she was also a businesswoman running a struggling ranch. Would she side with her manager's assessment that Valor represented a valuable asset that needed to be recovered? Or would she honor the horse's apparent choice to remain free? Only one way to find out. James dialed the number. "Elaine Miller," she answered on the third ring, her voice clear and direct. "Ms. Miller, this is James Peterson. We met a few days ago when you came to my cabin." There was a brief pause. "Mr. Peterson, is everything all right?" James took a deep breath. "Your ranch manager, Mitchell, was just here. He saw Maximilian." Another longer silence. When Elaine spoke again, her voice had lost some of its warmth. "I see. And where exactly did Carl see Max?" "Here, at my property. No point in denials now. Ms. Miller, I need to be straight with you. Max, Valor as I've been calling him, has been staying with me since he saved me from drowning in the river." "Saved you?" The surprise in her voice was evident. James explained the events of that day, his fall into the river, the white horse appearing at the critical moment, pulling him to safety. As he spoke, he realized how fantastical it sounded, but Elaine didn't interrupt. "That sounds like Max," she said softly when he'd finished. "He always did have an uncanny sense about people in trouble. Richard used to say he was more intuitive than most humans." There was a wistful quality to her voice, memories of her late husband clearly surfacing. Mitchell says he's going to come back, possibly with the sheriff, James continued. He seems determined to take Max back to Rockingham, whether the horse wants to go or not. And what do you want, Mr. Peterson? Elaine asked carefully. The question caught James off guard. He'd been so focused on Mitchell's threats and Valor's welfare that he hadn't fully articulated his own desires in this situation. I want what's best for Valor, he said finally. He's helped me in ways I can't fully explain, more than just saving my life that day, but I don't want to keep him if he'd be happier elsewhere. And you believe he's chosen to stay with you? Voluntarily? Yes, James said without hesitation. He comes and goes as he pleases. The stable is always open. Sometimes he disappears into the forest for hours, but he always comes back. The realization of how much that meant to him hit suddenly. He always comes back. Elaine was quiet for a long moment. Carl hasn't been entirely honest with you, Mr. Peterson. The ranch isn't struggling because I lack business sense. We're struggling because Carl has been mismanaging our breeding program and making poor investment decisions. I'm sorry to hear that, James said, unsure where this was going. The point is, Carl sees Max as a quick solution to financial problems he largely created. He wants to put Max back into competition or use him for breeding, regardless of what 3 years in the wild might have done to him. Her voice hardened. I won't allow it. Max was Richard's horse, his partner. Richard would never have wanted him forced back into that life if he'd found freedom elsewhere. Hope sparked in James's chest. So you're saying... I'm saying that legally, Maximilian still belongs to Rockingham M Ranch, Elaine interrupted. The brand and registration papers make that clear. Carl isn't wrong about that. She paused. But as the owner of Rockingham, I have some discretion in how our assets are managed. What are you suggesting? James asked cautiously. A compromise. Elaine's tone became businesslike. I'll come out tomorrow morning with papers transferring Max's ownership to you, a sale on paper. The price will be nominal, but it will be legal and binding. In exchange, I'd like visitation rights. To see him occasionally, make sure he's well. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. That seems more than fair. One more thing, Elaine added. Carl doesn't know I'm doing this, and I'd prefer to keep it that way until the paperwork is signed. He's been difficult lately, pushing boundaries. Understood, James agreed. We'll be here. After ending the call, James returned to the back stable. Valor stood at the half door, his white head gleaming in the afternoon sun. He nickered softly as James approached. Good news, James told him, stroking the velvety muzzle. Looks like you'll be staying officially, if that's what you want, of course. Valor pushed his head against James's chest in what had become their familiar greeting, as if affirming the arrangement. The rest of the day passed quietly, but James remained vigilant. He doubted Mitchell would return so quickly, but the man's parting words had carried a clear threat. As evening approached, James decided they would both sleep in the cabin for the night. Valor in the attached lean-to and James on the porch where he could hear any approaching vehicles. After a simple dinner, James sat on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Valor grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to scan their surroundings. The peaceful scene belied the tension that had entered their lives with Mitchell's visit. You know, James said as darkness began to fall, before you showed up, I was just existing out here, not really living. He looked at the horse who had paused in his grazing to listen. I thought isolation was what I needed, to be away from people, from reminders of everything I'd lost, but I was wrong. Valor approached the porch, standing close enough that James could feel his warmth in the cooling evening air. What I needed was connection, purpose. James reached out to stroke the horse's powerful neck. You gave me that, even though I didn't know I was looking for it. As night fully descended, James made one final check of the property before settling into the old rocking chair on the porch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders against the mountain chill. Valor stood in the lean-to, visible through the open doorway, his white coat almost luminous in the darkness. James drifted into an uneasy sleep, his military-trained senses still partly alert. His dreams were fragmented, images of the river, of Mitchell's cold eyes, of Valor running free across an endless plain. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep when a sound jerked him fully awake, not an engine or human noise, but Valor's warning snort. James sat up, instantly alert, hand automatically reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the clearing. Valor stood tensely in the lean-to doorway, ears pricked forward, nostrils flared. His posture communicated danger more clearly than words could have. James rose silently, straining to hear what had alerted the horse. For several long seconds there was nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night. Then, a soft metallic click, the sound of a vehicle door being carefully closed. Someone was approaching the cabin on foot from the direction of the road. James moved silently into the shadows beside the porch, his body automatically falling into the combat stance that had become second nature during his deployments. His eyes, adjusted to the darkness, scanned the tree line where the driveway emerged from the forest. The moonlight was both blessing and curse. It allowed him to see, but also made him visible to whoever was approaching. A figure emerged from the trees, Mitchell moving with the confident stride of someone who believed he had the upper hand. James remained still, watching as the ranch manager paused at the edge of the clearing, surveying the cabin and surrounding area. Mitchell appeared to be alone, but James didn't relax his vigilance. Years in combat zones had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. Inside the lean-to, Valor shifted restlessly, his hooves making soft sounds against the wooden floor. The noise drew Mitchell's attention, and he changed direction, moving toward the structure with purposeful steps. James saw the glint of something in the man's hand, not a gun, but a rope halter and lead. So that was the plan. Come in the night, take Valor quietly, present Elaine with a fait accompli in the morning. The simplicity of it was almost insulting. James waited until Mitchell was halfway across the clearing, before stepping out of the shadows. "That's far enough," he called, his voice carrying in the night air. Mitchell froze, then slowly turned toward him. "Peterson, didn't expect you to be such a light sleeper." "Military habit," James replied, moving forward to place himself between Mitchell and the lean-to. "Hard to break." Mitchell's gaze flicked from James to the lean-to and back again. "I think we got off on the wrong foot earlier. I'm not here to cause trouble." "Coming onto someone's property in the middle of the night usually counts as trouble in these parts," James observed. A tight smile crossed Mitchell's face. "I figured we could handle this man to man without getting lawyers or the sheriff involved. That horse is valuable breeding stock. The ranch needs him." "Yeah, I spoke with Elaine Miller this afternoon," James said. "She's coming by tomorrow with paperwork to transfer ownership to me." Mitchell's expression darkened. "Elaine doesn't understand what's at stake. That horse could save the ranch. Or you could just manage it better," James countered, repeating what Elaine had told him about Mitchell's poor decisions being the real source of the ranch's financial troubles. The accusation hit home. Mitchell's face flushed with anger, visible even in the moonlight. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," James replied. "I also know that trespassing at night to steal property is a good way to get yourself hurt." The threat hung in the air between them. Mitchell's hand tightened on the rope he was carrying, and for a moment James thought he might actually try something foolish. Then the fight seemed to go out of him all at once. "She's really transferring ownership?" he asked, sounding more defeated than angry now. "Tomorrow morning," James confirmed. Legal and binding. Mitchell shook his head slowly. 3 years I've been looking for that horse. 3 years of tracking rumors, following sightings. I had plans for him. Plans that didn't include what was best for Maximilian, James pointed out. He chose freedom over returning to the ranch. That should tell you something. They're animals, Peterson. They don't make choices. They follow instincts. A soft nickering sound came from behind James, and both men turned to see Valor standing in the lean-to doorway, his white coat almost luminous in the moonlight. The horse's gaze was fixed on Mitchell, his posture alert, but not frightened. That's where you're wrong, James said quietly. They do choose. They remember who treated them well and who didn't. They know the difference between freedom and captivity. Mitchell stared at the horse for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his face. He looks good, he admitted reluctantly. Better than I would have expected after 3 years in the wild. He's strong, James agreed. Smart, too. Smarter than most people give him credit for. A heavy silence fell between them. James remained vigilant, but he sensed that the immediate threat had passed. Mitchell's shoulders had slumped, the tension leaving his body as he accepted that his plan had failed. You should leave, James said finally. Come back with Elaine tomorrow if you want to be part of the official transfer, but tonight you're trespassing. Mitchell looked once more at Valor, then nodded slowly. Fine, but this isn't over, Peterson. Elaine might sign those papers, but I'm not convinced it's the right call. It's her ranch, James reminded him. Her decision. With a last lingering look at Valor, Mitchell turned and walked back toward the trees where he'd left his vehicle. James watched until the sound of an engine starting broke the night silence, followed by headlights cutting through the darkness as Mitchell drove away. Only when the last rumble of the engine had faded did James relax his stance. He turned to find Valor standing directly behind him, having silently left the lean-to while James's attention was on Mitchell's departure. That was close, James murmured, reaching up to stroke the horse's neck. But I think the worst is over now. Valor nudged him gently, warm breath ghosting over James's face in the cool night air. The simple gesture of trust and affection filled James with a sense of peace that had been elusive for too long. Let's get some rest, he said. Big day tomorrow. Dawn arrived with a clarity that seemed fitting for new beginnings. James and Valor were already awake, sharing a quiet breakfast in the clearing when the sound of approaching vehicles reached them. Two this time, Elaine's green pickup followed by a sheriff's patrol car. James felt a moment of anxiety at the sight of the law enforcement vehicle, but Elaine's expression as she emerged from her truck was reassuring. "Morning, Mr. Peterson," she called. "Hope you don't mind the company. After Carl's visit last night, I thought it might be wise to have Sheriff Williams witness our transaction." So Mitchell had reported back to her. James nodded a greeting to the sheriff, a solid-looking man in his 50s who regarded the scene with professional neutrality. "Carl's not joining us?" James asked. Elaine's expression tightened slightly. "Carl is clearing out his office at the ranch. We had a long conversation about management styles and future employment prospects." In other words, Mitchell had been fired. James felt a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying ease from his shoulders. Elaine approached Valor slowly, respect evident in her careful movements. The horse watched her with interest but didn't retreat. "Hello, Max," she said softly. "You're looking well." Valor nickered softly, extending his neck toward her in a gesture that wasn't quite familiar, but wasn't unwelcoming either. "He remembers you," James observed. "Horses never forget," Elaine replied with a small smile. She reached into her jacket and pulled out an envelope. "The transfer papers, as promised. Sheriff Williams will witness our signatures." The transaction took only minutes, a symbolic amount exchanged, signatures made official under the watchful eye of the law. When it was done, Elaine stepped back, regarding James and Valor with a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. "Take good care of him," she said. "And remember, I'll be checking in from time to time." "You're always welcome," James assured her. After Elaine and the sheriff departed, James stood in the clearing with the official papers in his hand, looking at Valor with a sense of wonder. The horse that had saved him from drowning was now legally his, or perhaps more accurately, he was legally Valor's. "So what now?" he asked the horse, who regarded him steadily with those intelligent eyes. "The whole world's open to us." Valor tossed his head, mane catching the morning light, and moved toward the trail that led to the river. He stopped a few paces away, looking back at James expectantly. James smiled, understanding the invitation. "Lead the way." Together they walked to the spot where their lives had intersected, where a drowning man and a wild horse had formed a bond that defied explanation. The river flowed peacefully now, sunlight dancing on its surface. James watched as Valor waded in, drinking deeply before lifting his head to regard James with what seemed almost like invitation. Without hesitation, James stepped into the cool water beside him. This time there was no fear, no struggle, only the shared moment between two beings who had found in each other exactly what they needed to heal. In saving James from the river that day, Valor had given him more than just life. He had given him a reason to truly live it,